In the wild, untamed landscapes of North America, long before paved roads, insulated homes, and central heating, there existed men who chose to live in places most people would consider uninhabitable. These were the mountain men, rugged individuals who carved a life out of the wilderness, moving through valleys, forests, and towering mountain ranges where the cold was an omnipresent force, a silent, invisible adversary that could claim life in hours if underestimated. Unlike modern humans who retreat to the comfort of climate-controlled environments at the first sign of snow, these men ventured out into a world where winter was relentless and survival required more than courage. It demanded understanding, respect, and instinct honed through years of living with the land. To truly grasp the harsh reality these men faced, one must first imagine the climate and the terrain they called home. Winter in the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and other ranges of the western frontier was not merely a season, it was a siege. Temperatures could drop to unimaginable lows, often plunging 20, 30, sometimes even 40 degrees below zero. Rivers and lakes, so vital to navigation and sustenance, would lock beneath thick sheets of ice, often masking dangerous currents beneath that could pull an unsuspecting man to his doom. Snowstorms were sudden, violent, and disorienting, capable of obliterating tracks, landmarks, and the very sense of direction that a man depended upon. A single miscalculation, a brief lapse in judgment, or an unprepared step into the wrong terrain could mean frostbite, hypothermia, or death. Yet, it was not just the intensity of the cold that posed a threat. The mountain men understood, often better than any modern survivalist, that cold was deceptive. A day could start clear and sunny, the air crisp but tolerable, lulling even the most experienced trapper into a false sense of comfort. By afternoon, however, the winds could pick up from the high passes, carrying snow and ice in a stinging, invisible torrent. Temperatures could plunge suddenly, and what seemed like a minor discomfort could quickly become a life-threatening ordeal. Unlike our modern reliance on weather forecasts and technology, these men depended on observation, intuition, and years of experience to anticipate such shifts. They learned to read the clouds, to sense the stiffness of the air, and even to interpret the behavior of animals, who often reacted instinctively to the approach of storms long before humans could perceive them. It is here, in this context, that the true genius of the mountain men emerges. They did not simply survive the cold, they thrived in it. They understood that it was not the cold itself that killed men, but ignorance of its signs and dangers. They observed that snow had different textures. The light, powdery snow might indicate a storm that was passing, while heavy, wet snow signaled a deeper, more dangerous freeze. They noted that the wind patterns across the ridges could hint at sudden temperature drops or coming blizzards. They watched the animals carefully, understanding that deer, elk, and smaller mammals could sense changes long before human eyes could detect them. Every observation, every detail mattered because in the wilderness, small mistakes had enormous consequences. Mountain men also recognized that the cold affected not just the body, but the mind. Hypothermia could creep in unnoticed, dulling judgment and slowing reflexes. Frostbite could start as a minor discomfort in fingers and toes, then rapidly escalate into tissue death if ignored. Survival required constant vigilance. They moved carefully, planning each step to conserve energy while maintaining warmth. They understood that stillness could be deadly, but reckless activity could be just as fatal. This delicate balance between movement and rest, exposure and shelter, was something modern adventurers often underestimate. For the mountain men, every day was a test of endurance, knowledge, and respect for nature's raw power. Their relationship with the cold was deeply practical, but also almost spiritual. It was not merely an obstacle to overcome, it was a teacher, a force that demanded respect and humility. Those who attempted to fight the cold recklessly often did not survive, while those who observed and adapted learned lessons that could mean the difference between life and death. They developed a kind of intimacy with the landscape, understanding the hidden patterns of ice and snow, the behavior of winter winds, and the subtle signs of a coming blizzard. This knowledge, honed over countless winters, was the true source of their strength. To endure such conditions, they relied on tools and skills that modern viewers might consider primitive, yet were remarkably effective. They crafted clothing from the furs and hides of the animals they hunted, creating layers that insulated them against the chill without trapping moisture, a critical distinction in preventing hypothermia. They built shelters from snow, logs, and brush that could withstand high winds and falling snow. Fires were not just comforts but lifelines, carefully constructed in sheltered locations to maximize heat while conserving precious fuel. They developed methods of food preservation, drying meat and storing supplies to ensure sustenance during long, frozen months when hunting and gathering were not always possible. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of their survival was the mental resilience they cultivated. The cold was relentless, unfeeling, and often demoralizing. It required not only physical preparation, but also mental toughness. Mountain men learned to pace themselves, to recognize their limits, and to keep a clear head under extreme conditions. They were patient, observant, and adaptive. They understood that arrogance or underestimation of the environment could be fatal. Their stories are filled with tales of men who survived by making careful, calculated decisions, and men who perished because they ignored the lessons the land itself was teaching them. Even the simple acts of daily life became exercises in survival and adaptation. Eating, sleeping, and moving all required strategies tailored to the harsh conditions. A meal was not just nourishment, it was fuel to generate heat. Sleep was not just rest, it required careful preparation to prevent freezing in the night. Every movement, from crossing a frozen river to climbing a snow-covered ridge, demanded constant awareness. In modern times, many of these practices have been forgotten, replaced by convenience and comfort. Yet, the mountain men understood that the cold was neither cruel nor cruelly indifferent. It was a challenge, a constant reminder of nature's power, and a teacher of resilience. They also relied on a network of knowledge passed down from Native American tribes who had lived in these regions for centuries. The mountain men learned how to track animals through snow, how to find hidden water sources under ice, and how to create temporary shelters that could shield them from wind and snow. They observed the timing of storms and the behavior of wildlife, incorporating these lessons into their own survival strategies. This was not mere imitation, it was adaptation. They merged indigenous knowledge with their own experiences, creating a deep, almost instinctual understanding of how to thrive in the cold. In many ways, their survival can be seen as a dialogue with the environment itself. They learned to read the land like a book, interpreting subtle cues and signals that modern humans might overlook. The crunch of snow underfoot, the pattern of icicles along a cliff, the movement of birds in the sky, all conveyed messages about the coming weather, the safety of a path, or the presence of danger. Every sensory input became a critical piece of information, and those who learned to listen closely often survived where others did not. In contrast, our modern lives have insulated us from the realities of cold. We live in heated homes, wear synthetic clothing, and travel in vehicles that protect us from the elements. We have lost the acute observational skills and adaptive strategies that once ensured survival. In doing so, we have also lost the respect for the cold that the mountain men understood so profoundly. They did not fear it in the way we do, nor did they treat it as merely uncomfortable. They recognized it as a force to be engaged with, understood, and respected. The legacy of the mountain men is a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the power of observation. They thrived not because they conquered the cold, but because they learned from it. They understood that survival in the wilderness was as much about knowledge and awareness as it was about strength or bravery. And in reflecting on their experiences, we are reminded that the lessons of the past remain relevant, that nature is powerful, that the cold is an exacting teacher, and that understanding and preparation can mean the difference between life and death. The cold of the mountains was more than a physical challenge. It was a crucible in which character, skill, and resilience were forged. Mountain men carried the lessons of countless winters in their bodies and minds, and every day in the wilderness was a testament to their ingenuity, patience, and respect for the elements. They remind us that survival is not about overcoming nature, but working with it, learning from it, and adapting in ways that honor its power. In a world insulated from the raw forces of the environment, their wisdom offers a glimpse into a relationship with the natural world that we have largely forgotten, but one that, if remembered, could teach us much about resilience, awareness, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The mountain men of North America were not solitary geniuses who simply stumbled upon survival in the frozen wilderness. Their ability to endure long, brutal winters was the product of careful observation, adaptability, and an extraordinary willingness to learn from those who had lived in the land far longer than they had. Central to this survival was the knowledge they acquired from Native American tribes who had thrived in these regions for centuries, mastering the rhythms of the land, the behavior of wildlife, and the subtle signals of the seasons. It is a lesson often overlooked today, a wisdom so profound that it could mean the difference between life and death in the harshest environments. Yet it was once second nature to those who chose to make the wilderness their home. The mountain men understood quickly that the cold was not something that could simply be battled. It demanded respect, and survival depended on knowing when to move, when to rest, and how to interact with the natural world in ways that minimized risk. Native Americans had long understood these rhythms, and the mountain men paid close attention to every piece of guidance offered, whether it came in spoken instruction or in observation of the tribe's practices. For example, they learned how to read the tracks of animals in snow, distinguishing not only the species but also the health, speed, and behavior of the creature. A simple print in the snow could indicate the presence of prey or a predator, and understanding these signs allowed mountain men to hunt efficiently while avoiding danger. But it was more than just tracking. They observed how Native Americans built their shelters to withstand snowstorms, how they selected firewood even in the most frozen terrain, and how they created layers of clothing from hides and furs that maximized warmth while preventing dangerous dampness. Every detail mattered. They learned that snow could be both an obstacle and a resource, that the orientation of a shelter relative to prevailing winds could determine whether a man froze or survived the night, and that the construction of a fire required not just wood, but an understanding of airflow, insulation, and heat retention. Food was another area in which native knowledge profoundly influenced mountain men. Tribes had developed methods of preserving meat and fish to last through the long winters, using smoke, drying techniques, and cold storage in snow pits. Mountain men adapted these techniques, recognizing that survival was not just about hunting. It was about conserving resources, creating sustainable food supplies, and understanding how to maintain energy in extreme conditions. They observed which foods generated the most warmth, which combinations provided long, lasting energy, and how timing meals could maximize the body's ability to generate heat. They learned to anticipate shortages and to plan for them, storing not just food but also knowledge about where to find more if needed. The mountain men also studied Native American methods of moving through deep snow and across frozen terrain. They learned how to use snowshoes and moccasins, not simply as tools, but as extensions of their bodies, allowing them to traverse long distances without exhausting energy or risking injury. They noticed how the tribes moved silently, efficiently, and deliberately, conserving strength while avoiding detection from animals or rival groups. The precision of this movement was critical. In the wilderness, careless steps could result in broken limbs, falls into icy rivers, or exposure to the cold, and learning from those who had already mastered the art of travel in winter landscapes saved countless lives. Beyond the practicalities of clothing, food, and movement, the mountain men absorbed a deep understanding of the cycles of nature from Native Americans. They learned to read the clouds, understand wind patterns, and predict weather changes based on subtle environmental cues. Birds, insects, and even the way snow accumulated on certain trees could signal an incoming storm or a shift in temperature. Animals, ever sensitive to their environment, offered warnings if observed carefully. Mountain men discovered that survival depended as much on anticipation as reaction. They learned that the wilderness was not random chaos, but a system with patterns, and that understanding those patterns was the difference between life and death. Equally important was the philosophy of survival that the mountain men adopted from native tribes. They understood that the wilderness was not something to be conquered, but a force to be respected. Pride or arrogance could be fatal. Those who ignored the subtle signs of weather, dismissed the importance of proper clothing and shelter, or underestimated the need for careful planning often did not survive. In contrast, those who approached the land with humility, patience, and attentiveness could not only endure but thrive. This mindset was perhaps as critical as any physical skill. Mental resilience allowed mountain men to make better decisions under pressure, to persist through adversity, and to remain calm when storms, predators, or other dangers threatened. Winter travel was especially instructive in this regard. The mountain men watched how Native Americans assessed the depth and stability of snow, avoiding areas where hidden crevices or unstable ice could collapse beneath a man's weight. They observed how paths were chosen to minimize exposure to wind and maximize access to shelter and water. They learned to carry only what was necessary, balancing the need for provisions with the need for mobility. Every journey became a lesson in foresight, careful observation, and deliberate action. Tracking prey in winter provided another example of native knowledge applied by mountain men. They learned to recognize subtle disturbances in the snow, broken twigs, displaced leaves, or patterns in animal prints that revealed not only presence but behavior. Understanding these signs allowed hunters to approach without startling their quarry, to predict movement, and to conserve energy by avoiding fruitless chases. It was a study of cause and effect, patience, and keen observation. The mountain men quickly realized that raw strength or speed was less important than knowledge, precision, and adaptability. In addition to practical survival skills, the mountain men absorbed lessons about community and cooperation from Native Americans. While often portrayed as lone wanderers, mountain men frequently traveled in small groups or relied on local tribes for guidance. They learned that information about weather, terrain, animal behavior, and resource locations was as valuable as food or weapons. By sharing knowledge and observing patterns collectively, they increased their chances of survival exponentially. This understanding of collaboration was a subtle yet powerful tool, often overlooked in the romanticized vision of the solitary trapper. Language and communication also played a role. Mountain men learned to interpret not only verbal guidance, but also non-verbal cues, body language, and cultural signs that conveyed critical survival information. A gesture, a glance, or the timing of an activity could indicate danger, opportunity, or change in conditions. Observing and decoding these signals sharpened their awareness and added a layer of strategic thinking that would have been impossible in isolation. In addition to shelter and survival strategies, the mountain men adopted native practices for conserving heat and energy. They learned to insulate themselves and their shelters using materials at hand: snow, leaves, animal skins, understanding how to create microclimates within harsh environments. They discovered the importance of regulating body temperature carefully, avoiding both overheating and chilling. They understood that sweat could freeze, creating immediate danger, and that fire and rest needed to be balanced carefully to maintain optimal warmth. Medicine and injury management were also influenced by native practices. Mountain men learned about natural remedies for frostbite, hypothermia, and minor injuries, and they studied methods of treating wounds in extreme cold where conventional care was unavailable. They understood that even small injuries could become deadly if infection set in or if they compromised mobility in freezing temperatures. Native knowledge of herbs, salves, and techniques became invaluable tools for long-term survival. Water, often taken for granted by modern adventurers, was another area where native wisdom proved crucial. Mountain men learned to locate water even when rivers were frozen and snow covered the landscape. They understood which snow was safe to melt, which ice contained hidden currents, and how to prevent contamination from natural sources. Access to safe water was critical not just for drinking, but for cooking, hygiene, and sustaining life over extended periods. The mountain men came to rely on careful observation and understanding of the environment rather than guessing or experimentation, reducing the risk of dehydration or illness. The mountain men's learning from Native Americans went beyond practical knowledge. It instilled a sense of rhythm and patience. Survival was not about rushing or dominating nature. It was about pacing oneself, understanding cycles, and aligning actions with the environment. They learned to appreciate the value of preparation, the importance of timing, and the rewards of careful observation. The land itself became a teacher, and the mountain men who listened closely thrived where others failed. Winter hunting, in particular, showcased this integration of native wisdom. Hunters had to understand the interplay between animal behavior, terrain, and weather. They learned when to track, when to wait, and when to move silently, using the landscape to conceal themselves while conserving energy. They understood the seasons, migration patterns, and the impact of snow and ice on animal movement. These insights allowed them to hunt efficiently, provide food for themselves, and avoid unnecessary exposure to deadly conditions. By observing Native Americans, mountain men also learned the importance of improvisation. Tools and resources were limited, and adaptability became a survival skill. They used natural materials creatively, built temporary shelters, and devised strategies on the fly. This flexibility allowed them to respond to unexpected storms, predator encounters, or injuries, giving them a resilience that rigid adherence to preconceived plans could not provide. Over time, the mountain men's understanding of the wilderness became almost instinctual. The knowledge they absorbed from Native Americans was internalized, forming habits, routines, and intuitive skills that guided them in every decision. The cold, the terrain, the animals, and the elements became a network of signals they could interpret without conscious effort. This level of mastery is difficult to appreciate in modern times, when convenience often shields us from the immediate consequences of error. The lessons from Native Americans also reinforced the mountain men's respect for nature. They learned that taking more than necessary, disturbing delicate ecosystems, or underestimating the environment could have dire consequences. Survival required harmony with the land, a delicate balance between human needs and environmental realities. In adopting this perspective, mountain men became not just survivors, but students of the wilderness, observing and interacting with it in ways that were thoughtful, deliberate, and respectful. This integration of observation, adaptation, and respect allowed mountain men to survive winters that would have killed most modern travelers. They learned to anticipate storms, locate food and water, build shelters, move efficiently, conserve energy, and maintain health, all guided by the wisdom of the Native Americans they observed and respected. Every skill, every habit, every observation was a lesson absorbed from a source far older and more experienced than themselves. In essence, the mountain men's survival depended on seeing the world as the Native Americans did, not as a place to conquer, but as a complex system to be understood. They realized that success in the wilderness was not measured by bravery alone, but by awareness, preparation, and the capacity to learn from those who had endured the cold for generations. In adopting this perspective, they transformed themselves from mere travelers into masters of winter, navigating the harshest landscapes with knowledge, skill, and patience. The mountain men of North America were more than hunters, trappers, and wanderers. They were masters of adaptation in a world where survival often depended on the smallest details. Among the many tools and skills that defined their existence, none was more essential than their understanding of clothing and layering. In the harsh wilderness, where winter temperatures could drop to extremes that would incapacitate the unprepared, the right clothing was not a matter of comfort. It was a matter of life or death. Modern insulated jackets, synthetic fabrics, and electric heaters might make us feel invincible, but the mountain men knew that survival required knowledge, ingenuity, and an intimate understanding of how to protect the human body against the relentless assault of cold. They did not wear a single heavy coat and expect it to shield them from the freezing air. Instead, they relied on layers, carefully constructed to provide warmth, mobility, and protection without trapping moisture, a subtle but critical distinction. Their outer layers were often made of animal hides, particularly deer, elk, or buffalo, which provided durable insulation and resistance to wind. Beneath these, they wore additional layers of softer furs or wool that trapped body heat, creating an insulating barrier that could be adjusted depending on activity, temperature, and exposure. They understood instinctively that layering was not merely a fashion choice, but a dynamic system that could be manipulated to maintain optimal warmth. The choice of material was deliberate and purposeful. Deer and elk hides were not just protective, they were breathable, allowing perspiration to escape while retaining heat. Wool, prized for its natural insulating properties, absorbed moisture without feeling wet, preventing the chilling effects of dampness. Furs, particularly from beaver or rabbit, were used to line gloves, hats, and boots, providing essential insulation to the extremities, which were the first to succumb to frostbite. Every material was selected with care, not for luxury, but for survival. The mountain men learned to recognize the qualities of hides, furs, and wool that would endure harsh conditions, protect against wind and snow, and remain flexible enough to allow movement during long treks through frozen landscapes. Their approach to extremities, the hands, feet, and head, was meticulous. Modern explorers often underestimate the danger of frostbite to these areas, but the mountain men understood that exposure could quickly become fatal. Gloves and mittens were often layered as carefully as the torso, with inner layers for warmth and outer layers for wind protection. Moccasins or boots were lined with fur and sometimes stuffed with grasses or moss for extra insulation, and hats often covered not just the head but the ears and neck, creating a microclimate of warmth that could mean the difference between enduring the cold and succumbing to it. They understood the subtle science of insulation, that trapping air between layers enhanced warmth, and that layering with different textures and densities could create pockets of heat that would survive even the most biting winds. But clothing was not simply about warmth. It was also about mobility. Mountain men needed to hunt, climb, build shelters, and navigate treacherous terrain while wearing these layers. Heavy, inflexible garments could hinder movement, slow reaction time, and even increase risk by limiting agility. They learned to balance insulation with flexibility, creating ensembles that allowed them to bend, crawl, and climb without sacrificing protection. Layering became a system of modular survival. They could add or remove layers depending on activity, whether crossing a frozen river, tracking game through deep snow, or hunkering down for the night. Understanding how to manage moisture was equally critical. Sweat, a natural byproduct of exertion, could quickly become a deadly liability if trapped against the skin. Mountain men learned that dampness in the cold could lower body temperature faster than exposure to freezing air alone. They therefore selected fabrics and arranged layers to allow evaporation, absorbing minimal moisture while retaining heat. They avoided heavy, non-breathable materials and often rotated layers, adjusting insulation as conditions and activity changed. This delicate balance between warmth and dryness was a constant, calculated effort honed over years of trial and observation. The mountain men's approach to clothing extended to repair and improvisation. Hides and furs could tear, seams could split, and leather could crack under the stress of cold. Mountain men carried needles, sinew, and scraps of material to patch clothing in the field. They understood that a torn mitten or a leaking boot could quickly become a life-threatening vulnerability, and they treated clothing maintenance as a daily necessity. They also adapted their clothing to seasonal changes, creating combinations that could withstand sudden temperature drops, windstorms, and snow accumulation. In many ways, clothing was a living system, constantly adjusted and maintained to respond to the environment's unpredictable nature. The layering system also reflected a deep understanding of thermoregulation, the science of maintaining body temperature under extreme conditions. The mountain men instinctively knew which layers would generate the most warmth when active, which could be removed during strenuous activity to prevent overheating, and which should remain in place during rest to prevent chilling. They understood the dangers of overexposure, wind chill, and the cumulative effects of fatigue and cold on the human body. Their clothing was not static. It was an adaptive system, responsive to both external conditions and internal physiology. Beyond function, clothing held symbolic and psychological importance. The mountain men were entering a world where every miscalculation could be fatal, and well-prepared clothing provided not just warmth but confidence. Each piece, each layer of hide, wool, or fur was a tangible assurance of survival. Donning a well-constructed outfit was an act of preparation, a mental reinforcement that they could endure the challenges ahead. In the frozen wilderness, this psychological edge was as vital as any physical protection. Confidence, resilience, and mental clarity were preserved by the knowledge that their bodies were shielded against the worst the environment could throw at them. Hats and hoods, for example, were carefully designed to protect the head, ears, and neck, areas where heat loss was rapid and frostbite common. Mountain men often layered hats under hoods, sometimes incorporating fur linings, creating a protective shell against wind and snow. Scarves or neck gaiters were used to cover the lower face, minimizing exposure and reducing the chilling effects of breathing in frigid air. These seemingly simple additions were, in fact, essential components of a sophisticated survival system. The gloves and mittens of the mountain men reflected a similar ingenuity. Inner layers provided dexterity and warmth, while outer layers shielded against wind, snow, and ice. Fingers could be individually insulated or grouped depending on activity, and mittens were often paired with inner gloves to allow fine manipulation of tools while preserving warmth. Every decision, from material to fit to layering, was informed by experience, observation, and necessity. Footwear, too, was a critical element in their survival. Frostbite could immobilize a man, leaving him vulnerable to exposure, predators, or injury. Mountain men layered moccasins with furs, adding grass or moss for insulation and comfort. They understood the importance of keeping feet dry, balancing warmth with breathability, and ensuring that boots could endure the stresses of snow, ice, and rough terrain. The soles were sometimes treated or reinforced to improve traction, prevent moisture seepage, and reduce heat loss to the frozen ground. Every step became a carefully considered action, informed by an intimate understanding of both anatomy and the environment. Mountain men also adapted clothing to the activities of the day. Hunting required stealth and mobility, so layers were adjusted for flexibility and sound reduction. Trapping demanded patience and long periods of stillness, requiring insulation that could preserve warmth without hindering observation or dexterity. Travel across frozen rivers, snow-covered ridges, and icy valleys demanded layers that could be quickly added or removed, allowing them to respond to sudden changes in temperature or exertion. This adaptability was central to their survival strategy. Maintenance of clothing was as much a part of survival as wearing it correctly. Furs and hides required cleaning, drying, and occasional oiling to maintain their insulating properties. Tears and rips had to be repaired immediately to prevent further damage and exposure. Mountain men carried essential tools for these tasks, including needles, sinew, and spare materials, often performing repairs in the field under challenging conditions. They treated clothing as living equipment, constantly adjusted, repaired, and optimized to meet the demands of the wilderness. The mountain men's understanding of clothing was further enhanced by experimentation and observation of how materials interacted with the environment. They learned that certain furs performed better in wet snow, while others trapped heat most effectively in dry conditions. They observed how layering could create microclimates, how ventilation could prevent moisture buildup, and how proper fit could optimize insulation without restricting movement. Over time, they developed a nuanced and almost instinctual understanding of these principles, which allowed them to endure temperatures that would incapacitate a modern traveler in minutes. Even the smallest details were considered. Hoods were adjusted to shield eyes from wind, blown snow. Cuffs were secured to prevent drafts. Inner layers were arranged to prevent chafing and maintain comfort during long journeys. Socks were layered and sometimes wrapped with additional materials to provide extra insulation for toes. Every decision, every adjustment, every piece of clothing reflected a combination of practical knowledge, experience, and observation, knowledge that was critical in a landscape where failure could be fatal. The mountain men's approach to clothing and layering was a living testament to human ingenuity in the face of extreme adversity. It combined material science, anatomy, environmental observation, and practical experience in ways that modern survival manuals can only describe abstractly. Their garments were not merely protective. They were tools, weapons against the cold, and instruments that allowed them to interact with their environment on equal terms. They did not conquer the cold by force. They mastered it through knowledge, preparation, and a profound understanding of how the human body responds to extreme conditions. In an era without synthetic fabrics, heated cabins, or weather forecasting, the mountain men created a system that balanced warmth, mobility, moisture management, and psychological comfort. They understood that survival was holistic. It required not only the right clothing, but also the wisdom to use it effectively, the mental discipline to adjust to changing conditions, and the constant vigilance to maintain and repair every layer. Their garments were living extensions of their survival strategy, integrating centuries of observation, experimentation, and adaptation. Ultimately, the mountain men's expertise in clothing and layering was emblematic of a larger truth about survival. It is rarely brute force that ensures life, but careful attention to detail, observation of the environment, and the intelligent application of knowledge. They teach us that the cold is not merely an obstacle. It is a teacher, and those who learn its lessons can endure, adapt, and even thrive where others falter. In every stitched seam, every layered hide, and every carefully insulated extremity, the mountain men demonstrated a mastery of their environment that continues to inspire, instruct, and awe. In the frozen wilderness of North America, where snow blanketed the ground for months and icy winds cut through the valleys, survival demanded more than clothing, skill, and courage. The mountain men knew that the essentials of life, food, fire, and fuel, were not mere conveniences. They were the lifeblood of existence in a world that offered no mercy to the unprepared. While modern travelers rely on grocery stores, restaurants, and instant heat, the mountain men had to generate warmth, sustain energy, and ensure the continuity of life entirely from the resources around them. Their understanding of these elements was both practical and profound, a system of survival honed over years of experience and observation, passed down and learned from Native American tribes, and refined through trial and necessity in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Food to the mountain men was never just a source of sustenance. It was fuel, energy, and warmth packaged in a tangible form. In the bitter cold, the human body burns calories at an extraordinary rate simply to maintain core temperature. Every movement, whether chopping firewood, hiking through deep snow, or setting traps, required energy. The cold itself saps strength, chills extremities, and slows reaction times. The mountain men learned quickly that underfeeding oneself was as dangerous as exposure to the elements, because a body deprived of fuel cannot generate heat efficiently, cannot think clearly, and cannot act decisively. Their diets were meticulously designed to meet the demands of winter survival. Meat, both fresh and preserved, formed the cornerstone. Game hunted in the forests, deer, elk, bison, rabbits, and smaller animals, provided protein and fat necessary for warmth and energy. Mountain men learned the value of fat in particular. It was a dense source of calories and generated heat more efficiently than carbohydrates alone. They preserved excess meat through drying, smoking, or freezing in snow, ensuring a steady supply even when hunting was impossible due to storms or scarce prey. This practice was not merely convenience. It was a deliberate strategy to mitigate the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. Nuts, berries, roots, and other plant-based foods supplemented their diet, providing essential vitamins, minerals, and energy, while protein and fat were critical for generating warmth, Micronutrients were necessary for sustaining long-term health. Mountain men learned which plants could be safely eaten in winter conditions, how to identify edible roots beneath layers of snow, and how to store these items to prevent spoilage. Every morsel was evaluated for its energy content, nutritional value, and ease of transport. They carried compact, high-energy foods during expeditions, understanding that weight, caloric density, and preservation were all intertwined. Food preparation was an equally critical skill. Raw consumption of meat or plants was sometimes necessary, but cooking offered multiple advantages. Heat from cooking warmed the body, made food easier to digest, and sometimes neutralized harmful bacteria or toxins. Mountain men learned to cook efficiently over small fires, using minimal fuel to produce maximum warmth and sustenance. Meals were carefully timed, often coinciding with the coldest parts of the day or immediately following strenuous activity, to maximize energy retention and maintain core temperature. Every decision about when and how to eat was informed by experience, observation, and necessity. Fire, of course, was the mountain men's ultimate ally against the cold. A well-constructed fire provided warmth, light, protection, and the ability to cook food, but fire in the wilderness was not guaranteed. It required fuel, skill, and understanding of the environment. Mountain men learned to locate suitable firewood even under deep snow or frozen soil. They observed the types of trees and branches that burned efficiently, the density and dryness of wood that generated heat without excessive smoke, and how to build structures that protected flames from wind and snowfall. Fire was a living entity in the wilderness, and those who could manipulate it effectively gained a significant advantage over the environment. Constructing a fire was as much an art as a science. Mountain men often built windbreaks from logs, snow, or natural terrain features to shield the flame. They learned to start small kindling that would catch quickly and then gradually add larger logs to create a sustained burn. They understood how to layer fuel to maximize heat output while minimizing the risk of extinguishment. Fire was never frivolous. Every spark was precious, every flame a vital defense against the merciless cold. They also learned to conserve fuel, understanding that excessive use could deplete resources needed for future survival. The psychological impact of fire cannot be underestimated. In the frozen wilderness, darkness and cold can erode morale, sap energy, and induce despair. A crackling fire provided not just warmth, but a sense of security, a focal point around which the body and mind could stabilize. It allowed mountain men to rest, eat, plan, and interact safely. They understood that maintaining a fire was as important for mental resilience as it was for physical survival. Fuel management extended beyond the immediate fire itself. Mountain men stored wood, brush, and other combustible materials strategically, often anticipating days or weeks of storms. They observed the land, noting the types of trees that would provide the best fuel, where dead wood was accessible even under deep snow, and how to transport and store materials without losing their effectiveness. Fuel was a finite resource, and its careful management was essential for enduring long, harsh winters. The combination of food, fire, and fuel formed an integrated system of survival. Eating high-calorie foods without fire to cook them left the body vulnerable. Maintaining a fire without sufficient fuel risked sudden exposure. Collecting fuel without consuming adequate calories could exhaust the body, making it less capable of sustaining warmth. Mountain men understood this intricate balance, adapting daily routines to ensure that energy, warmth, and protection were maintained simultaneously. Their lives were structured around this triad, and mastery of it often determined whether a winter ended in survival or tragedy. Observing Native American practices profoundly influenced mountain men in these areas. Tribes had developed methods for efficiently gathering and storing firewood, identifying and preparing high-energy foods, and constructing long-lasting fires. They demonstrated ways to preserve meat and plants for extended periods, sometimes using snow or ice to store perishable items safely. Mountain men adopted these techniques, refining them for their own purposes, and over time, these practices became instinctive. They learned to anticipate shortages, create reserves, and plan for contingencies in ways that allowed them to survive months of isolation and extreme cold. Fire was also a tool for signaling, protection, and communication. Smoke could signal location to companions, deter predators, or indicate human presence to travelers. Fire's warmth allowed mountain men to work efficiently in extreme conditions, whether repairing equipment, preparing food, or navigating treacherous terrain. They understood that every fire had multiple purposes beyond mere heat, and its management was a critical skill that required constant attention, observation, and practice. Water, closely linked to food and fire, was another vital component. Snow and ice were often melted for drinking water, but mountain men understood that not all snow was safe or efficient to use. They learned to select clean snow, melt it using minimal fuel, and store water for times when access to running streams was impossible. Efficient water management was as important as food and fire, ensuring hydration, cooking capability, and hygiene in extreme conditions. Mountain men also learned to adapt meals and fires to changing conditions. During storms, when fuel was scarce or conditions made cooking difficult, they adjusted their routines, relying on preserved foods or alternative heating methods. They learned to ration calories intelligently, consuming the most energy-dense items during periods of high exertion and balancing intake with expected energy output. Every decision was strategic, reflecting an intimate understanding of human physiology, caloric requirements, and environmental demands. The interdependence of food, fire, and fuel extended to mental fortitude. Survival in extreme cold was as much about morale as it was about physical warmth. Knowing that a fire could be lit, that food could sustain energy, and that fuel was available created a psychological safety net. The mountain men approached each day with careful planning, assessing resources, anticipating challenges, and executing strategies to maintain this delicate equilibrium. The ability to remain calm, focused, and deliberate in the face of freezing temperatures was inseparable from their mastery of these essential elements. Every aspect of their interaction with food, fire, and fuel reflected ingenuity. From constructing fire pits that retained heat efficiently to arranging meals that maximized caloric benefit while minimizing preparation effort, the mountain men demonstrated a deep understanding of cause and effect in the wilderness. They innovated constantly, adapting techniques to new environments, unexpected weather events, and the availability of resources. Improvisation was not a luxury, it was a requirement for survival. Hunting itself was intertwined with these survival systems. Successful hunts provided food, but they also yielded materials for clothing, shelter, and fuel. Fat, bones, and hides were all utilized strategically. Mountain men processed game with careful attention, ensuring that every part contributed to sustenance or protection. This efficiency reflected an ethic of survival that demanded mindfulness, respect for the environment, and resourcefulness. Even leisure and rest were mediated by fire and food. Sleep in the wilderness was never entirely safe. Mountain men arranged fire placement, shelter orientation, and bedding to maintain warmth throughout the night. Meals were timed to coincide with periods of greatest need, such as before or after extended travel or hunting expeditions. Every action was planned, deliberate, and integrated into a system that optimized survival under extreme conditions. Ultimately, the mountain men's mastery of food, fire, and fuel represents a synthesis of observation, adaptation, and foresight. It was not mere luck or brute strength that allowed them to endure the harshest winters, but a sophisticated understanding of energy, heat, and sustenance. They learned to anticipate challenges, manage resources carefully, and create systems that integrated physical needs with environmental realities. Their success in surviving the cold demonstrates not just resilience, but an extraordinary ability to harmonize human activity with the rhythms of the natural world. Food provided energy, fire generated warmth, and fuel sustained both. These three elements, managed intelligently, formed the foundation of survival. Mastery of this triad allowed mountain men to traverse frozen valleys, hunt in blizzards, cook meals in sub-zero temperatures, and endure nights in shelters built from snow and timber. Their lives were defined by this constant interplay, a delicate dance that required skill, attention, and respect for the natural order. In studying the mountain men, one realizes that survival in extreme cold is not about overcoming nature through brute force, but about understanding, preparation, and intelligent application of knowledge. Every decision about what to eat, when to light a fire, how to gather fuel, and how to conserve resources reflects a careful balance honed over years of experience. Their mastery of food, fire, and fuel ensured not only physical survival, but also mental resilience, adaptability, and a profound respect for the environment. Through this lens, the wilderness becomes less a hostile adversary and more a complex system to be understood, respected, and worked with. The mountain men's ability to thrive where others perished offers timeless lessons in observation, ingenuity, and the practical application of knowledge. Food, fire, and fuel were not merely necessities, they were instruments of survival, teaching the mountain men the value of preparation, foresight, and adaptability. By mastering these essentials, they endured winters that would have killed most men and left a legacy of wisdom that continues to inspire those who seek to understand the unforgiving beauty of the natural world. In the frozen wilderness of North America, survival demanded more than clothing, food, and fire. The mountain men understood that how they moved, and more importantly, how they thought about survival, could be the difference between life and death. Movement in extreme cold was not random, it was deliberate, measured, and strategic. Every step, every adjustment, every decision about when to exert energy and when to conserve it was informed by years of observation, experience, and an intuitive understanding of the wilderness. The mountains and forests were not simply backdrops. They were active participants in a dynamic relationship, shaping the body, testing endurance, and challenging the mind at every turn. The terrain was unforgiving. Snow could reach depths that swallowed a man's legs. Ice could conceal hidden crevices and treacherous rivers, and jagged rocks and fallen trees became obstacles that demanded agility, strength, and constant attention. Yet, mountain men did not move recklessly through these landscapes. They developed a rhythm, a flow, that allowed them to conserve energy, maintain warmth, and avoid injury. Movement was integrated with observation. A step taken incorrectly could not only slow progress, but risk frostbite, exhaustion, or fatal falls. The cold was not passive. It was actively testing their resilience, and only those who respected its demands could survive. Traveling in deep snow required specialized techniques, many of which were learned from Native Americans. Mountain men adopted snowshoes to distribute weight over the surface, preventing them from sinking into drifts and conserving energy with each stride. They learned to adjust stride length, pace, and gait depending on snow density, incline, and wind exposure. Each movement was purposeful, balancing speed with safety, endurance with caution. Even when using moccasins or fur-lined boots, they understood that missteps could cost not only energy but warmth, as wet feet from snow could quickly lead to hypothermia. But movement was not solely about walking or traversing terrain. It was also about positioning in the wilderness, especially in relation to shelter, hunting grounds, and water sources. Mountain men developed acute spatial awareness, understanding how to navigate valleys, ridges, and forests to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure to the elements. They used landmarks, natural formations, and even the behavior of animals to guide them, relying on observation and memory rather than modern maps or GPS. Every decision about which path to take, when to rest, and when to move was informed by an understanding of both immediate conditions and long-term survival needs. Hunting and trapping demanded a different approach to movement. The mountain men learned that stalking prey in winter was a delicate balance between patience and action. Moving too quickly or loudly could spook animals and waste valuable energy. Moving too slowly could lead to exhaustion and exposure. They observed animal behavior, tracks, and environmental cues to plan their approach, sometimes waiting hours or even days for the perfect moment. This required not just physical endurance, but mental discipline, focus, and adaptability. Every movement was calculated, each decision a reflection of the interplay between instinct, observation, and knowledge. Movement was also closely tied to the preservation of warmth. The mountain men understood that stillness in extreme cold could be deadly, leading to frostbite, hypothermia, or a general decline in physical capability. They moved to generate body heat, to circulate blood, and to maintain muscle function. Yet movement had to be balanced with conservation of energy, as overexertion could cause sweating, which, when it froze, became a dangerous liability. They learned to pace themselves, alternating periods of activity with rest, adjusting intensity according to terrain, weather, and personal condition. Movement became a carefully managed resource, as essential as food or fire. The mindset of the mountain men was as critical as their physical movement. Survival in extreme conditions demanded patience, resilience, and mental flexibility. They approached the wilderness not as a foe to be conquered, but as a teacher to be understood. They recognized that arrogance or impatience could be fatal. The mountains were indifferent to human existence. Storms, cold, and predators operated according to their own rules. Understanding this required humility, a recognition that survival was as much about observation and adaptation as it was about skill or strength. Mental fortitude was honed over countless winters, often under isolation and extreme stress. The mountain men traveled alone or in small groups, far from settlements or companions, and they had to rely on their judgment, awareness, and decision-making skills. The cold challenged not only the body, but the mind. Blizzards obscured landmarks, whiteouts disoriented travelers, and the monotony of snow-covered landscapes tested patience. Maintaining clarity of thought, focus, and calm was essential, and the mountain men developed strategies to preserve mental resilience, including routine, observation, and mindfulness of their physical and environmental state. They also learned to respect their limits and read the signals of their own bodies. Fatigue, hunger, and exposure affected judgment, reflexes, and endurance. Mountain men observed how these factors influenced decision-making and adapted accordingly. Rest was not indulgence, it was survival. They learned when to press forward despite discomfort and when to pause, shelter, and conserve energy. This interplay between body and mind movement and rest, action and observation, became a core principle of wilderness survival. Collaboration and observation of others reinforced mindset and movement strategies. Traveling in small groups allowed mountain men to share knowledge, monitor one another's condition, and coordinate movement for safety and efficiency. They learned from Native Americans who demonstrated how to move silently, efficiently, and deliberately through snow and forest, conserving energy while minimizing risk. Every step, gesture, and action carried lessons in discipline, observation, and adaptability, creating a cumulative understanding that reinforced both survival skills and mental resilience. Psychological adaptation to cold and isolation was crucial. The mountain men understood that fear, panic, or despair could compromise judgment, slow movement, and increase risk of injury or exposure. They developed mental routines and strategies to maintain composure, including observation of familiar patterns, reliance on accumulated knowledge, and focus on actionable tasks. Every movement became a conscious exercise in resilience, reinforcing confidence and control in conditions that would otherwise be overwhelming. The mountains themselves dictated strategy. Mountain men learned to use terrain to their advantage, seeking ridges for visibility, valleys for shelter, and natural formations for windbreaks. They understood that the environment could amplify or mitigate risk, and movement was adjusted accordingly. They timed travel to coincide with optimal conditions, using early mornings for hunting, mid-day for crossing difficult terrain, and evenings for shelter and rest. Every movement was synchronized with environmental cues, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of how to harmonize human activity with the rhythms of the wilderness. Patience was intertwined with movement. The mountain men knew that success in hunting, navigation, and survival required waiting for the right moment, observing conditions, and acting decisively when opportunity arose. They learned that rushing, forcing decisions, or ignoring environmental signals could result in disaster. Deliberate, measured movement became a manifestation of wisdom, experience, and strategic thinking. Every action was purposeful, minimizing risk while maximizing efficiency and safety. Mountain men also developed anticipatory thinking. They predicted how weather, terrain, and resource availability would affect movement, planning routes, shelter, and activity schedules accordingly. This foresight was critical in winter, when storms could appear suddenly and snow could make even familiar paths impassable. They understood that movement was not reactive alone. It was proactive, informed by observation, experience, and an ongoing assessment of risk versus reward. In addition, mountain men cultivated adaptability. Conditions in the wilderness were rarely static. Temperatures, wind, snow, and terrain could change in minutes. They learned to adjust movement, pace, clothing, and activity in real time. This flexibility was not just a physical skill, but a mental one requiring attention, observation, and decisive action. The ability to pivot, adapt, and respond effectively to changing conditions became a defining characteristic of successful survival in the cold. Mental resilience was reinforced by a profound sense of purpose and determination. Mountain men understood that survival required both skill and willpower. They cultivated focus, self-reliance, and a calm acceptance of the challenges they faced. Fear of cold, isolation, or danger was tempered by knowledge, preparation, and experience. The mind, like the body, had to be trained, disciplined, and conditioned to endure adversity. Movement and mindset were also inseparable from experience with failure. Mistakes, missteps, misjudged distances, misread weather were often dangerous, sometimes fatal. Mountain men learned to internalize lessons from these experiences, refining techniques, improving judgment, and reinforcing mental resilience. Every successful expedition strengthened their confidence, while every error reinforced the consequences of inattention or arrogance. Over time, movement became almost instinctive, guided by accumulated wisdom, environmental cues, and careful observation of self and surroundings. Even rest periods were strategic. Mountain men understood that conserving energy, maintaining warmth, and planning future movement were integral to survival. Shelter was chosen not only for protection from wind and snow, but also to facilitate rest, recovery, and preparation for the next journey. Meals were timed to maximize energy retention, fires maintained to ensure warmth, and clothing adjusted to regulate body temperature during sleep. Every aspect of downtime was integrated into the broader strategy of survival, blending movement, planning, and psychological preparation. Group dynamics also influenced movement and mindset. When traveling with companions, mountain men coordinated pace, shared responsibilities, and monitored one another's condition. They observed how group cohesion, mutual support, and shared knowledge increased efficiency and reduced risk. Travel became a cooperative effort, blending individual skill with collective strategy. This balance of self-reliance and collaboration reinforced both physical survival and mental stability. The mountain men's understanding of movement extended to resource management. They planned routes to optimize access to water, firewood, and food, adjusting pace and distance based on availability and necessity. Movement was a tool for resource acquisition, ensuring that energy expenditure was justified by gain. This efficiency was critical, as unnecessary exertion could deplete calories, sap warmth, and increase exposure to the elements. Every step was intentional, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect in the wilderness. Ultimately, the mountain men's mastery of movement and mindset exemplifies the integration of body, mind, and environment. Survival in extreme cold was not determined by brute strength alone, nor by isolated skills, but by the harmonious combination of deliberate movement, strategic observation, mental resilience, and adaptive thinking. Every decision, stride, and action was informed by this interplay, allowing them to endure winters that would have killed less experienced men. The lessons they offer remain timeless. They demonstrate that survival is a holistic endeavor, demanding not just physical capability, but psychological discipline, adaptability, foresight, and respect for the natural world. Movement is not aimless, and mindset is not passive. Together, they create a system of resilience, efficiency, and preparedness that can sustain life in even the harshest conditions. The mountain men moved not just to survive, but to thrive, demonstrating that mastery over the wilderness is as much a product of intelligence, observation, and mental fortitude as it is of physical strength. As we reflect on the lives of the mountain men, a deeper understanding emerges, not just of their skills, but of a philosophy of survival that seems almost lost in the modern world. In the 21st century, convenience, technology, and urbanization have insulated us from nature's extremes. We walk streets cleared of snow, sleep in heated homes, and drive vehicles that protect us from wind and cold. Yet the mountain men thrived in conditions that would overwhelm most modern humans. They did not simply endure. They thrived, guided by principles, habits, and wisdom that are rarely taught today. To understand their mastery of the cold is to confront the lessons we have forgotten, the instincts and practices that once allowed humans to survive and even flourish in the harshest environments. Central to these lessons is respect for nature. The mountain men understood that the wilderness was not an enemy to be conquered, but a system to be understood. They observed the rhythms of wind, snow, and wildlife, interpreting subtle signs that could indicate a change in weather, the presence of prey, or the approach of danger. Every tree, footprint, and cloud formation became data, every pattern a guide. This respect was not passive. It was active, requiring attention, humility, and the willingness to adapt. Modern life often encourages dominance over nature, altering rivers, clearing forests, and insulating ourselves from environmental realities. But in doing so, we have lost the finely tuned observational skills that once kept humans alive. The mountain men remind us that survival begins with attentiveness, patience, and a willingness to learn from the world around us. Closely tied to this is the principle of preparation. Mountain men planned for storms they could not predict, for shortages of food, for extreme temperatures that could freeze a man's hands in minutes. They understood that survival depended on foresight, layering clothing, storing fuel, preserving meat, and maintaining tools were not optional. They were life-sustaining routines. Modern society often prioritizes immediacy and convenience over planning and prudence. We rely on external systems to solve problems instantly, rather than cultivating the foresight and resourcefulness that were once essential. The mountain men teach us that preparation is more than collecting supplies. It is a mindset, a disciplined approach to anticipating challenges and equipping oneself to meet them successfully. Another forgotten lesson is the integration of body and environment. Mountain men did not treat their bodies as separate from the land. They observed how exertion, rest, and nutrition interacted with cold, wind, and terrain. They understood that maintaining warmth was not simply about clothing, but about pacing movement, regulating hydration, and consuming energy, dense food. They adapted constantly, balancing activity with conservation, motion with rest. Modern humans often neglect this integrated perspective, treating physical fitness, diet, and environmental exposure as separate issues. The mountain men demonstrate that survival requires harmonizing these factors, creating a continuous feedback loop between body, mind, and surroundings. Observation was perhaps their most undervalued skill in today's world. The mountain men were keenly attuned to subtle changes in snow, the way animals moved, the sound of cracking ice, or shifts in wind direction. These observations informed decisions about shelter, hunting, and movement. Modern humans, surrounded by technology, rarely engage in this level of direct environmental awareness. GPS, weather apps, and prepackaged meals reduce the need to read natural signs, yet in doing so, we have diminished our capacity to understand and respond to the immediate world. The mountain men's attentiveness reminds us that survival is not just about resources. It is about perception, cognition, and the ability to interpret the signals that the environment continuously provides. Resourcefulness is another lesson largely forgotten. Mountain men relied on what was available in their immediate surroundings: snow, trees, furs, stones, and wildlife, and transformed these materials into tools, shelters, and clothing. They repaired equipment in the field, improvised solutions, and reused every possible resource. Modern culture often promotes disposability, convenience, and specialization, leaving little room for improvisation or adaptation. The mountain men show us that ingenuity, creativity, and a willingness to work with what is at hand are not optional skills. They are essential for survival in an unpredictable